Okay, Zakta Helig Gemara. We got to the first two dots yesterday. The Gemara told us, the Mishnah told us, that an Eved and a Shivcha are Nemon to tell us until we're the Trumas. Not that they're measuring it, but they're saying Edus that they saw the people who did measure it, the experts, and the experts said that this is where it comes to. Zakta Gemara Shaloi Amru Chachamim es Adover Lahachmer El Lahakel. The reason why the Chachamim trust them is because they relaxed the rules about Edus when it comes to Tchumen, because they're trying to give us as much range as possible. Frek the Gemara. We learned that the whole concept of Tchumen is a Chumrah, not a Kula. And all the way at the end of yesterday, David mentioned, isn't Tchumen Deraisa? So I think I responded, even if Tchumen is Deraisa, Rabbi Yonason said it's 12,000 amas. And again, I don't know where that comes from. But the limitation of 2,000 amas is definitely the Rabbanon. Of course, the fact that they limited our range to 2,000 amas is a chumrah, but the way they want it practiced, the way they want it measured, is going to be lakula utchumen derabban.
Could it be the size of the Machne Yisrael? Is 12? Is it? Do you remember? We learned this. I don't remember the number.
We learned that it was 8,000 amas.
8,000. Oh.
So I'm not sure where the 12,000 amas would come from, unless it's 8,000 plus 2,000 amas in either direction. But then you still need the 2,000 amas.
Okay.
So this leads us to a very interesting shaila that Tosha brings up. So Tosha says, if we're saying that the only reason why a pasal la'ed, such as an Eved and a Shivchar Neman, is because Tchumen Derabanan, that would indicate that anything Deraisa, they wouldn't be Neman for. So Tosha, mashma you have a Deraisa, loy mehemni, they would not have been believed. For Tosha, how could that be? We know we do believe pasal la'edim for inyanim of Deraisa. The Yafagav the Maisa b'chol yom shemaminim l'noshim b'shchita v'nikor v'litrim chala. We trust women to keep a kosher home. So that's an Eid Echad. She's not a kosher Eid, and we rely on her for deraisas. Zok the Gemara, Hainu Lishum, to have a biyoda, kodim shenasas ashchita, have a biyoda lishchot. We only believe women, or posel Edim, on things that are within their power to do it correctly. Since she's going to be doing it, or at least supervising it, and it's within her power, we'll believe her that it was done. But to tell us stam testimony about something that's out of her control, there she would not be neman.
Are we talking about Shivcha Kananis or Shivcha Relis? Kananis.
Why would a Shivcha? Well, a Shivcha is no different than any other lady who's a pasal edus. But an Eved means Eved Kanani, because an Eved Ivri, it has the same status of a regular Yisrael when it comes to saying edus. So Tosfos is making a distinction. When do we trust a pasal aid? That's if it's in their power to do. But if they're just telling us something about what somebody else does, such as where the experts measured Tchum Shabbos, there you don't believe. Based on this, Tosfos says, "L'hachi nemon katon tfei bebedikas chametz mibetchumen she'enu nemen bekutnai loimer atkan hayunu mahach." Now, Tosfos, that's why we understand why you can believe a cotton for bedikas chametz, because he could make the bedika himself. Yet you don't trust the cotton to tell us where they used to walk until. We should the bedikas chametz biyadei. For Tosfos, we have a problem. Because if hard come bedikas chametz b'noshim v'avodim himnu rabbanim b'derbanim, the Gemara tells us that the only reason why noshim and avodim are neman to tell us that the bedikas chametz was made is because since it's the rabbanon, we trust him. Mashma, the Yavad Rasha, loy hemdum, we would not have believed him. Afal gav the biyadei, it's biyadei. Zok, that's because it's a different problem. Don't say this over at home. We're talking about Erev Pesach. Hainu mishum the bedikas chametz tzarich diktuk the Torah Gadol. Doing the Bedika is very, very difficult. It takes a lot of work. On Erev Pesach, men work hard. They can be trusted to do B'dikas Chametz. But women, no, they can't be trusted for the Indian of B'dikas Chametz because they might be lazy and not do it thoroughly. They might not go for that 10th piece of bread. They might just go look for 9 pieces. And therefore, only because it's the Rabbanon are they believed. And the Chein Mashu Yisham, Medikam Adam Denoshim Ein and Nemanis B'dikas Chametz, Nation at Tzilois, Uvaikos Kolshu. Don't be by the Kanav. So what we see here from Toysis is that by a Derbonon, they could change the requirements. Even though normally, like Abba the Raisha the Kedin, they wouldn't have an amonis of Edus, the Rabbanon, when it's their requirement, they can decide that even Noshim, even Tzula Edus, could have an amonis. Okay. Zot the Heilige Mishnah. Ir Shel Yachid. So I just suggest nobody tell their wife over this Toysis. Erev Pesach has her slaving, getting the house prepared for Pesach. Don't tell them that they're not nemenes because we're afraid they're going to be lazy and not do it properly. Zot the Heilige Mishnah. Now here the Mishnah is taking a turn, and we've been talking about Tchumen until this point. Right after this Mishnah, we're going to return to the Inyan of Tchumen, and here in the middle, the Tana interjects a Mishnah that's talking about Shitufe Muvuyos, about Erev Chetzeres, that has absolutely nothing to do with what we're discussing. And the Tiferes Yisrael offers an explanation as to why the Tana interjects this over here. And he says, the last Mishnah talks about the liberal stance that the Rabbanon took. When it comes to the Rabbanon, they can make decisions who to believe, who not to believe. They're in control of the halacha. Therefore, they're going to be able to arbitrarily, of course it's not arbitrarily, but they're able to decide how much nemonis you need, who's neman on it. So by Tchumen, we find that concept. So now the Tana wants to throw in another example of something that they control. It's their mitzvah, it's their chiyuv, such as Erev Chetzeres, and they also have the discretion to be mekel when they want. So what we're talking about here is Erev Chetzeres. Erev Chetzeres and Shituf Muvut. So there's a couple of interesting things that we need to be aware of. And that is that the Rabbanon was Machayev Erev Chetzeres, sometimes even when it's not necessary. For instance, we learned that if people are in a chutzner, they want to be able to walk in the common chutzner. Their homes are completely private to themselves. The chutzner is a little bit more public. Now, from a Deraisa perspective, there's no difference between their chutzner and their house. If it's in the Deraisa, there's only 2 Rishuyos, Rishus HaYochid, Rishus HaRabbim. According to Rashi, in order to qualify as a Rishus HaRabbim, you need to have 2 things. A, the roads have to be 16 amas wide. And B, there has to be an area that's populated by 600,000 people. Those are the 2 things you need to be a Rishus HaRabbim. And if you have those 2 things, then it's also to carry more than Daled Amas in that area. And it's also to carry from a Rishus HaYochid into that area. Anything besides that, there's no problem with carrying. So you can carry in a chutzner, you can carry in a mavui, because it's not a Rishus HaRabbim. However, the Rabbanon made a gzeira that they said, we're afraid if we let you carry from a place that seems to be more private, such as your own home, into a shared area, like a chutzner, it will look like someone's carrying to a Rishus HaRabbim, and people might start carrying in Rishus HaRabbim if we let them carry in their chutzner. So therefore, you need to do something that makes it clear to you that this is a Rishus HaYochid, and it's not a Rishus HaRabbim. And what did they say we should do? We should make an Erev. We should take food. Everybody should contribute to a bundle of food. We'll place it in one of the homes, and that's going to sort of create an indication, a proclamation that this chutzner is not public domain. It's private, shared by the people in the chutzner. Now, what happens if there's multiple chutzeres in a neighborhood that open up to a movi, and that movi opens up to Rishus HaRabbim? Again, that Mavi is not a Rosh Hashanah because it doesn't have the two necessary traits that a Rosh Hashanah has to have. Yet it's still more public than even the Chatzar because multiple Chatzeris have access to that Mavi. So you need something called Shitufim Avuyos, which essentially is Erev Chatzeris on a grander scale that's inclusive of more people. So let me ask you, once we've done Shitufei Mavuyos, once the 10 Chatzeris that open up to a Mavi join together as one, why do we now still need Erev Chatzeris? We shouldn't. It's redundant because everybody's already joined as one. Yet it's required. The reason why it's required is because the Chachamim said we don't want people to forget the Inyan of Erev Chatzeris. Sometimes it is needed if it's just a Chatzar and there is no Mavi. So in order that we shouldn't forget, Shalot T'Shtakach Teres Erev Chatzeris, they require an Erev Chatzeris even when there's Shitufim Avuyos. And for that same reason, even if you have an area that's not a Rosh Hashanah, sometimes they'll force you to make an area distinct that won't be included in the Erev. So if you have a big city and you want to make an Erev around it, even if it's not a Rosh Hashanah Deraisa, but if it's a big city, there's 600,000 people in it, they will mandate that you cannot make an Erev around the whole city, only part of the city, because otherwise people are not going to remember the whole concept of Rosh Hashanah. So and that's really what the Amish is talking about, is the Darbonic requirements not to make an Erev around certain places, even though they're not really a Rosh Hashanah, because they want people to remember the idea of Erev. And the Mishnah starts off as follows. Ir Shel Yochid. So just to finish off, and that's why the Tiferes Yisrael explains this Mishnah is here. Because again, this is a Darbonic concept, and they can decide, and we'll see, they use their discretion to decide when they should apply it and when they shouldn't, similar to the discretion that they're taking when it comes to who can be believed on Erev Tchum. Zok the Mishnah, Ir Shel Yochid, the Nasa Shel Rabin. You had a city of Yochid. What is the definition of a city of Yochid? Rashi learns it's a city that didn't have 600,000 people. We're soon going to see, Rashi is going to tell us, the city we're discussing not only didn't have 600,000 people, it also didn't have any streets that were 60 namas. So it's really not a Rosh Hashanah. So the Ir Shel Yochid, it was a city that didn't have 600,000 inhabitants or 600,000 people who frequent its streets. In Nasa Shel Rabin. And the city expanded, it became bigger, and now it's a city that does have 600,000 people. But Rashi is careful to point out it's still not Rosh Hashanah Deraisa because it still doesn't have roads that are more than 60 miles. Zok the Mishnah Ma'arvin Eskula. You're allowed to make an Erev around the entire city. It started off as a completely Ir Shel Yochid you could all put it into one Erev. It became a Mokum Rabbim. Now, a city that's a Mokum Rabbim that starts off with 600,000 people, you would not be able to make Erev around the whole thing, even though technically it's not a Rosh Hashanah, even if it has 600,000 people, because it doesn't have streets that are 60 namas. Nevertheless, the Rabbanan say a city that started off as a big city, you could not make an Erev around the whole thing. But if it started off as a small city and it grew, then you could still make an Erev around the whole city. V'shel Rabin, v'nasa shel Yochid. What if you had a city that held 600,000 people? You couldn't make an Erev around the whole thing. And then it became like Detroit. People moved out. It became a democratic city, and its residents were fleeing. And the city went down to below 600,000. There, even though now it doesn't have 600,000 people, it doesn't even have big streets. Nevertheless, Ein Ma'arvin Eskula, they're not allowed to incorporate the entire city with one big shituf. Ella imkain asa chutzala kir chadasha shaviyud. They have to isolate at least one neighborhood that's large enough that it's similar to this in size to the city called Chadasha that was in the region of Yehuda. Sheyesh b'chemisha diyurin diver Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda said you cannot incorporate the whole city. You cannot incorporate the whole city in the shitufim avoids. You have to exclude at least one neighborhood that has at least 50 people. And this way, people in the city will remember that there is such a thing as Erev Chetzeris that cannot apply to a Rosh Hashanah. So even though this whole thing is the Rabbanan here, the Rabbanan are saying in this case, since the city started off as a larger city, even though it was never a Rosh Hashanah Deraisa, we're going to make a Gzeira in order that people shouldn't forget about Eruvin. That there's certain places where you could walk and there's certain places where you can't walk. Rabbi Shimon Omer, the area that must be excluded from the Eruv doesn't have to be such a big neighborhood of 50 diurin. It's enough of Gimel Chatzeres Shel Shnei Batim. If you have 3 Chatzeres and each Chatzer has 2 homes in it, which is a total of 6 families, that's enough of an area that you can exclude from the Eruv that would be allowed, and then you'd be able to include all the rest of the city in the joined Eruv. Zok Gemara. Can you give me an example of just such a city that started off as a small city and then its population expanded? Omer Yehuda, a simple example, is Kagoin Diskarta de Reish Galusa, a city that the Reish Galusa moved into. He moved into a small little city. It was called a city Shal Yochid, Ir Shal Yochid. And Rashi says once the Reish Galusa is there, it attracts a lot of traffic because people come to the Reish Galusa to ask shaylas, to discuss communal matters. It becomes a real gathering point, and that itself causes the city to grow. Amalei Rav Nachman asked Rav Yehuda, out of all the cities that have grown that you could have used as an example, why did you pick a city that has a unique characteristic and that grew because there's a Reish Galusa there? My time. Ilemi mishum deshchichi gabi harmona, and therefore midkiri adodi. Are you going to suggest that since a lot of people gather together there, they'll remind each other about where it's a Rosh Hashanah, whether it's an Ir Sharabim, they're not allowed to make an Erev there? Since there's a lot of people there, it's not likely that Eruvin will be forgotten because there's a lot of people to remind each other. Is that the special reason why you picked this city and you wanted to indicate that other cities that don't have a specific attraction would not have this kula? That's not true, Zot Reb Nachman, because kula Yisrael nami b'tzafre de Shabbat shchichi gabe adodi. There's a very shver Rashi over here. Rashi says every city on Shabbos morning people get together. Why do people get together? We know why, because of Kiddush. But Rashi says a very difficult explanation. Rashi says the Shabbat shchichi adodi l'shmoya drosha, to hear the speech. I don't know. I thought they won't get together because of Kiddush. But I'll call upon him. What Reb Nachman is saying is, why would you pick an example of a city which could mislead us into thinking that a regular city that grows wouldn't have this heter to make the Erev, when in fact, logic should dictate that any city that has a lot of people shouldn't be a problem because they'll remind each other. Therefore, Omer Reb Nachman, I disagree with your example. I'm going to give you a different example of a city that expanded. Discarded in Zoy. This fellow in Zoy lived in a small city that grew. It just, the Zoy was a regular guy. He wasn't a Nasi, he wasn't a Reish Galusa. And just like this city, any city that grows, it's not going to be a problem because we don't have to worry that people will forget about Eruvin, because since people come together for Kiddush, for the Rav's Drasha, people will remind each other. Tana Rabban. Now we have a nice brisa that expands on the Mishnah and gives us some more insight with some more examples. Ir Shal Yachid v'Nasas Shal Rabim. Just like the first case of our Mishnah, the Rosh Hashanah are very specific. And the Rosh Hashanah goes through it. So this is unlike our Mishnah's case, which Rashi tells us never had a road that was 60 amas wide. Here we have a city that actually has Rosh Hashanah. So now it's a real Rosh Hashanah. It's a city with 600,000 people frequenting it, and it has a Rosh Hashanah. Now, the definition of a Rosh Hashanah, to make a city, to make a Rosh Hashanah, is when you have a big street that enters the city on one side and literally intersects the whole city and exits on the other side, such as the 401. It enters the city on the west and then goes straight through the city and then exits the city on the east. If you have a big thoroughfare that runs from end to end with no hindrance in between, that's a classic case of Rosh Hashanah. And that's the case that we're describing here. We've already learned many times that you cannot enclose a Rishus Rabbim. You can't magically make an Erev around Rishus Rabbim, and now you can carry there. But this brisa is not going according to the Shita that we assume. Rather, it's going to a Shita, according to a Shita that actually allows you to close in and make a Rishus Rabbim into a Rishus Yachid. Ketzad Ma'arim. How do you make an Erev around this Rishus Rabbim, the Raisa? Ketzad Ma'arim Noisa. Zok the Brisa. Oisa Lechem Mikan, Lechem Mikan. Go to the 401 in Mississauga where we enter the city and put a post there. Go on the 401 to the end of Scarborough and put a post there. And now the 401 became a Rosh Hashanah. Try putting up a private toll booth on the 401 and see how long it lasts. So it says here, this brisa, not like we know, says that you can actually enclose, virtually enclose, even a Rosh Hashanah deraisa and make an air there. You can actually carry there. The Gemara is going to tell us, of course, this is not a we pass like, but there is such a sheet. What you cannot do is split the city in half and make an Erev on half of the city. Either you have to make one big Erev around the whole city, because if you make an Erev on half the city and not on the other half, or on two halves independent of each other, what's going to happen is the people who have an Erev and the people who don't have an Erev, they both have access to the main thoroughfare. And since not all the people in the whole city made an Erev, now that main thoroughfare has joint interests, and that's going to cause issue. No different than if there's two people in the chutzner, or there's three people in the chutzner, and two of the three made an Erev, and the third didn't join, the interests of the third party is going to ruin the unity of the Erev, and nobody can carry there. Therefore, this city, everybody has to be in there. But there's a plan B. If you don't have everybody in the Erev, you can't split the city in half. Every neighborhood needs their own Erev. This is going to be puzzling. Because if the reason is because my interests intersect your interests in the main thoroughfare, what's the difference if we make Erev on half the city at a time, or if we do each neighborhood? It should still have the same problem. And in fact, the Gemara is going to discuss that.
So what about our city?
I'm sorry?
What about Toronto? We don't do the whole city, right?
That's right. But so the reason why Toronto is not relevant is because we don't include the 401 in our Erev. It's excluded from everybody's Erev. So the problem is if there's a certain area that multiple parties have interest in, and those multiple parties haven't joined in an Erev, that's where there'll be a problem. All the areas that we would share, so to speak, big streets that go through all our neighborhoods, those are specifically excluded from the Erev. They actually put the Tours of Pesach around it to specifically exclude it from the Erev.
Right, but even the areas that we include is not the entire city. So it's just the Jewish neighborhood. So
the neighborhoods that we include, everybody in those neighborhoods are part of the Erev. But if a neighborhood on the north side of the 401 and on the south side of the 401 made two independent Eruvin, and these 401 would be included in the Erev, then our interests would clash on the 401 itself.
What about people outside the Erev that we made?
So there's not a problem.
Okay.
So Zok the Hil Gemara, Hoysa Shal Rabbin, Parei Shal Rabbin. What if you have a city that never changed status? It started off as a big city, and it's still a big city. So there, you cannot include the entire city in the Erev. The Ein law, Ella Pesach Echad. But it only has one gate. Meaning, imagine if at the east end of the 401, where it leaves Scarborough to Pickering, they put up a big, massive block wall and shut the 401 down. Now there's only an opening on one side of the city, not on the other side of the city. That loses its status of Rosh Hashanah. And Rashi tells us the reason is because in the Midbar, the roads in between the camps went from end to end, uninhibited. And unless you have that characteristic, it's not technically a Rosh Hashanah deraisa. So since there's only one door to the city on one side, not on the other side, so the street doesn't go right through. Therefore, ma'arvin is skula. You would be able to put an Erev around the whole city because that does not have the status of a Rosh Hashanah.
Where do we know there is? Where do we know there was a road in the Midbar?
I don't know, but somehow
And
the Gemara must know that.
Seems they didn't follow the road because they traveled in a rectangle. Three shvatim, three shvatim, three shvatim.
Yeah, but I guess in between the Shvatim, there must have been a road that goes from one end of the Machane to the other end of the Machane.
Mechatesa. I don't know where they got that.
I think they got it because of I know the 60 Namas comes from the width of the two wagons. And I guess the wagon was able to go through the Machane in a main road. I'm not sure exactly how we know that.
I thought the Ananea covered, produced the roads. Maybe that's what they're talking about. Because that flattened all the land
But we're not talking about a road, an intercity road. We're talking about an intracity road, meaning a road that goes from one end of the Machane to the other end. So it must have been, even when they were camped, they had roads that the masses could walk through. Okay. The Erie is a very big chiddush. What we're learning right here is if one end is blocked completely, that's not a Rosh Hashanah. The Meiri says, even if it's offset, meaning if it's not a straight line from one end of the city, from the doorway at one end of the city to the doorway at the other end of the city, if the road jogs, it means you got to make a left and a right or a right and a left. So the road offsets, that also would not be considered a Rosh Hashanah deraisa, unless it's straight through. So Montana, the Mi'arva Rosh Hashanah, who holds you can make an Erev in Rosh Hashanah. So we're going back now to the prior case where if you have a Rosh Hashanah that goes through from end to end, the Brisa says you could put a lechi on one end, a lechi on the other end, and then you can even make the 401 into a Rosh Hashanah. You can make an Erev on the 401. Who holds like that? Rabbi Yehuda, he's the famous Rabbi Yehuda that we learned about so many times, even though we don't pass like him. The Tanya, yes, Yalkein Amar Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda said, if a person owns two homes directly across the street from each other, a street that was a Rosh Hashanah, he could enclose the area in between his two homes. That section of street in between his two homes, he can make them into a Rosh Hashanah for himself so that he can carry them. And how do you do it? And then he can carry there. And the art scroll has a very nice picture. We've seen it many times. Here's the house on one side of the street. Here's the house on the other side of the street. So he made a lechi over here so that people from this direction see that this area is sectioned off. People coming from this side will see this lechi. No, it's sectioned off. And now this area here, even though there might be hundreds of thousands of people driving up and down, for him, it's a virtual Rosh Hashanah, and he can now carry it. So you see, Rabbi Yehuda holds, you can actually make an Erev around a Rosh Hashanah deraisa, and it'll become your virtual Rosh Hashanah. Now, and that's who our Brisa is following. However, our Chachamim, who we pass like, said, Amr Loi, they told Rabbi Yehuda, Ein ma'arvin Rosh Hashanah b'kach. You cannot make an Erev in Rosh Hashanah using your plan. And that's why we wouldn't be able to enclose the 401 in an Erev, because we don't hold a Rabbi Yehuda. Amar Mar. Now we're going to go back to analyze another case that the Brisa discussed. You cannot make an Erev on half the city. Amar Papa. There's different ways to split the city. That the Brisa says that if you have a main thoroughfare running through the city, you cannot make an Erev on half the city at a time. That's only if the line that is the border between the neighborhoods is right down the road. So it's parallel to the road, it runs around the road, which means half the road is going to be north of the Erev, and half the road will belong to one side, and half the road will belong to the other side. So the R scroll has a very simple picture to depict that, and that's here at the bottom. As you can see, the dotted line runs direct, that's like the yellow center line of the road. if you wanted to split it so that everybody on one side of Bathurst is in one Eruv, and everybody on the other side of Bathurst is in the other Eruv, and the yellow line in the middle of the road between the northbound and southbound traffic is the demarcation point, that would not be allowed. And the reason why it wouldn't be allowed, the Gemara is about to tell us, is because how do you get in and out of the city? By the two ends, which means both the people on one side of this road and people on the other side of the road both need to access the road on both sides to be able to get out of the city and to get in the city. So since everybody here needs access to this main road, it creates a blend, and therefore everyone's going to answer. The people on this side, their interest in this road will answer on these people, and the interest that these people have in that road will answer on these people, and that's why you cannot make an Erev on a half a city. However, Dr. Papa, if you didn't split it that way, rather the line, the demarcation point, was perpendicular to that street, then it's different. Why is that? So let's look at a picture. Meaning, if you split it this way. The reason why it's ma'arvin is because all of these people here will use the door to the city that's closest to them, and they'll remove their rights, they'll relinquish their rights to this side of the street. And all the people on this side of the Erev will use this door exclusively, and they'll relinquish their rights to this side of the street. So it creates an actual separation. Therefore, this arrangement and this configuration would be allowed. So let's see what the Gemara says. Zok the Gemara, Amar Papa loy Amru ela la'arka. This that we say that you cannot split the city naf is la'arka, because they both need access to the road to access both doors. Aval l'rachba ma'arvin, because we could stick to the west. The people on the west will stick to the door on the west, and the people on the east will stick to the door on the east, and we don't need Drisha Regel, we don't need rights on the other side. Zok the Gemara command loy Rabbi Kiva. This would not be consistent with Rabbi Kiva. Now, let's first get clarity in what our case is. Our case is the people on one side of the line are all mu'urav together. They're allowed to carry in their area, and they're allowed to carry on their side of the street to go to their entrance or exit to the city. The other people on the other side of the line have their whole erev, and they have access to the other side. Now, each party has their own erev with each other, and we say that the two parties, independent of each other, don't cause a problem because of their rights to the other side of the road. Because we say this party will stick to their side of the road, and that party will stick to their side of the road. Rabbi Kiva seems not to hold like that, because Rabbi Kiva is talking about a case where you have to go through one chotzer to get into the next chotzer. When we were in yeshiva, we didn't have a standard modern dormitory. We had an old house. And in some old houses, sometimes you have to walk through one room to get into the next room. So the people in the outer room have a lot of traffic going through their room, and that could be annoying sometimes. And we used to refer to that configuration as the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim. So the inner room would be the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and the outer room would be the Kodesh. So there was a configuration of Chetzeris with a Kodesh and a Kodesh HaKadoshim. The Kodesh meaning the outer room that even the inner people have to access to get to and fro from their room, and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is exclusive, only the people who live in the Kodesh HaKadoshim have to access the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And there was a machlokes there. Now, what happens if the people in the Kodesh made an Erev Chetzeris for themselves, did not include the people of the Kodesh HaKadoshim there? And the people of the Kodesh HaKadoshim didn't make an Erev at all, which means all the people who live in the Kodesh HaKadoshim can't even carry in the Kodesh HaKadoshim because they don't have an Erev Chetzeris. And the question was, can the people who at least live in the Kodesh, could they at least carry in their Chaser because they made an Erev with each other? Everybody holds, both Rabbi Kiva and the Chum hold, is that since the people in the Kodesh don't have an Erev and it's usher for them to carry even in their own Chaser, and we know that they have a right of access to walk through the Kodesh because that's how they get in and out, they'll also ruin the Erev of the people in the Kodesh. However, what if the people of the Kodesh made their own Erev Chetzeris, and the people of the Kodesh HaKadoshim made an Erev as well? Which means Now the people in the Kodesh Kadoshim can walk around the Kodesh Kadoshim at least. They can carry in the Kodesh Kadoshim because they made their own little Eruvin. So there's an Eruvin in the Kodesh Kadoshim and there's an Eruvin in the Kodesh, but they didn't blend Eruvin. Would the rights that the people in the Kodesh Kadoshim have to walk through the Kodesh, would those rights ruin the Eruv of the people in the Kodesh? Rabbi Kiva holds it ruins it. The Chachamim hold it doesn't ruin it. Rabbi Kiva's expression of how he explains how it ruins it is as follows: Ha'amar regel hamutaris b'mkoima. The people who live in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, where they could carry in their own place, their regel is mutaris b'mkoima. In the Kodesh HaKadoshim, they're allowed to carry around because they made an eruv. Oiseres afilu shaloi b'mkoima. They'll still ruin the eruv for the people in the Kodesh because of their rights to walk through the Kodesh, and they didn't make one big eruv. So based on Rabbi Kiva's svara, just because we're on the right side and you're on the left side, and we go out through our door and you go out through your door, the fact is we still have rights to that whole street, and therefore, even if you split it perpendicular to the road, it would still be usher to carry there, because our interests mess up your road and your interests mess up our road. That's what the Gemara suggests. So that's the Gemara. No, there's a very big and obvious distinction. Where the people in the Kodesh HaKadoshim have no choice. They have to access the Kodesh in order to be able to get out. The Plinius les lepescha. There is no way for the people in the inner Chater, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, there is no way for them to get in and out other than walking through the Kodesh. The Plinius les lepescha achrina. Aval hacha, but in the case where you split the city perpendicular to the main road, we could sever completely. Hani nafki b'hai pischa, v'hani nafka b'hai pischa. We each could go out through the door, through the half of the street that belongs to us. So there's no reason to say that we intersect and there should be an issue. That was one approach to what the Papa said. Ikadabri, there are those who quoted your Papa a little differently, and they said as follows: Omar Papa, loy teimel orcha hu deloy ma'arvin, aval rachba ma'arvin. Don't say that it's only if the demarcation point is at the center of the street, parallel to the street, there you can't do it. But if you did it perpendicular, you could do it, like we just did a moment ago. Don't say that. Even if you cut the city in half, perpendicular to the main street, that's also going to be a problem. Come on. Who is that consistent with? Rabbi Kiva. Because Rabbi Kiva is the one who said that regel hamutaris bim koima will answer afilu shaloi bim koima. So after Gemara, no. Afilu temer rabbanon. Even in the rabbanon, in the case of the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKodeshim, where they said that the Kodesh's eruv remains good and it won't get ruined, here it might be worse. Akan loy kami rabbanon hasam el b'shtei chatzeros zuluf nimizu. Where did the rabbanon say that it's mutter, that the eruv does not get messed up? That's if you have a Kodesh and a Kodesh HaKodeshim. Why is that? Because they're two independent chatzeros. There's even a wall in between them. And therefore, the pnimis achta ladasha umishtamsha. The pnimius, they can close their door. They can totally cut themselves off. The Kodesh can totally cut themselves off from the Kodesh HaKadoshim. And Tosha speaks out, just the fact that we're going to walk through the Kodesh to get in and out, that's not such a problem, because we're still formally severing our rights to walk in that other area. Aval hacha, but when you're splitting the city, mi motzim misalki rishus harabim mehacha, that main thoroughfare is a rishus harabim. You can't just cut it in half. You're not there. If we're talking about the borders of our chutzner, we could sort of make a partition and sever ourselves. But if we're both accessing the rishus harabim, we can't just split a rishus harabim, and therefore, in our case, it might be worse. Now the Gemara is going to analyze another part of the Brisa. And that was the final part of the Brisa that says, Amar mar oikula oimavu mavu b'fnei atzmi. You can't split the city in half. You have a choice. Either make the entire city one big area, or then you have to split it neighborhood by neighborhood. Zok Gemara. Maishna the lechatzoyin lo the Lechatzoyin, the loy, split the city in half. We just discussed you can't do it. The Asri Adadi, each of the individual groups that made their Erev together, their interests clash in the main Rosh Hashanah, because that's where everybody needs to access to get out of the city. Well, Mavi Nami. So even if we split the city into 20 parts, at the end of the day, all of our individual groups, their interests clash when they come into the main thoroughfare. So Mavi Nami Asra Adadi. If two people clash with each other, 20 people or 20 groups will surely clash with each other regarding the access to the main road. Zakta Gemara, you're right. But Hachadamayaskinam could go into Ovid Daka. The way the Ritva learns is very fascinating. He learns, again, what are we looking at? We're looking at, let's say, a series. Here we have one line that splits it east and west. Imagine if you had a line in between each set of boxes. So basically, every two boxes would be their own mavli. And we split it into 20 Eruvin. What we're talking about is at the back of each mavli, they open the door to the Rosh Hashanah. They open the door not to the Rosh Hashanah, a door to leave the city. So now each mavli doesn't have to access the main thoroughfare to get out of the city through one of the main doors, because there's a back door at the back of every single mavli. So now nobody needs to access the Rosh Hashanah anymore. So they can totally sever themselves from the Rosh Hashanah. So now there is no contradictory interests in the Rosh Hashanah, because everybody uses a different doorway to get out of the city. So Zok the Gemara, what the Brisa means, that it's Mavi b'fnei atzma, that means only if there's a separate door from each neighborhood, from each Mavi to the outside. So technically, if you split the city in half and each side had a door to the outside, it would have worked just as well. The main point here is that the only way to avoid a clash of interests in the main thoroughfare is if each group has a direct access to leave the city. The Chihad Amar of Idi Bar Avin, Amar Abchista. Echad mebnei Mavli, she'asa daka lepescha. Let's say there's 50 people in the Mavli, and 49 people joined in the Erev, in the Shitufim Mavlis, and one guy didn't. Normally, what that does is that ushers everybody in the Mavli. Zok Abchista, if that one guy made a private door from his chutzner straight into the Rosh Hashanah, so he no longer needs to access the public area to get to the Rosh Hashanah, his interests will not answer the rest of the people in the Mavi, because we look at him like he's excluded himself and isolated himself from the rest of the Mavi, and therefore his interests in the public area are relinquished, isolated, and they will not answer for everybody else. What if the city was always a city of a rabbin? If it was always a city of a rabbin, we know the rule is you cannot make an Erev around the whole city. You have to exclude at least one neighborhood. The Mishnah says it might be a neighborhood of 50 families, it might be a neighborhood of 6 families, but there has to be some exclusion. Reb Zera Arva Lamasa Devei Reb Chia. Reb Zera came to a city that Reb Chia once upon a time lived in, and it seems like Reb Chia was no longer there or alive, and he made an Erev in this city. It was a big city, the Loshavik Lashir, and he didn't isolate a neighborhood, which seems contrary to the halach. Abaye told Reb Zera, my time of Mar Hachi. How could you incorporate the whole city into one Erev without excluding a neighborhood? Amalei, so Reb Zera said, Abaye, I did my research and I spoke to the old people of the city to get some information on the history of the city. And Sabi, Amalei Sabi Dida, the elders of the city told me, they told me, to Amalei Reb Zera told Abaye, Sabi Dida Amarli, the older people of the city told me that Reb Chia Bar Asi, many, many years ago, when Reb Chia was around, Ma'arav Kula, he made an Erev around the whole city. So if he made an Erev around the whole city, even though now I acknowledge the city has more than 600,000 people, if Reb Chia years ago made an Erev around the city, it must be that the city originally was an Ir Shal Yochid. And our Mishnah says, a city that started off as an Ir Shal Yochid, and it grew, you could still make an Erev around the whole city. So since they told me that Reb Chia made an Erev many moons ago, Vamina, I told myself it must be the only reason why Reb Chia would have made an Erev many moons ago is Shemami no Ir Shal Yachid V'Nasa Shal Rabami. Even though now I know it's a big city, but the fact that the Bechia made an Erev many years ago means that it was once a small city. And our Mishnah says, if it was once a small city, even if it becomes a big city, I'm still allowed to make my Erev around the whole city. And that's exactly what I did. Amalei Abai told Reb Zeir, you did partial research, but you didn't do enough research because you didn't find out specifically why Reb Chia made this Erev many years ago. And you misinterpreted it as telling you that it must have once been an Ir Shal Yochid. And that's where your mistake was. Let me tell you what these old people told me. That this city, many years ago, was always at Ir Shal Rabim. But one of the entrances to the city was blocked. We said if you don't have a thoroughfare that can go right through from one end to the next end, it's not a Rosh Hashanah. And in fact, that's what they had there. Because one door of the city, which is where the main thoroughfare would have exited through, was blocked with a big dump. And therefore, he made the Erev, because it follows a different protocol, a city that doesn't have a street going through it. But it was always a big city. But the Hashda now, the Ipanula Ashba, now that they did improvements in the neighborhood, and they moved the Ashba out of there, and now this same street goes right through, it's a true Rishus HaRabban Meraisa, V'asir, when you cannot make an Erev. Omer Lei, so Reb Zeir responded to Abaye, Lavadatoy, wow, I didn't know this. I made a mistake. And in fact, I'm going to have to cancel my Erev because it's not lawful, because this is a Rishus HaRabban.
Yes, I just want to point out that every big city was once a small city.
Oh, that's a beautiful thing to point out, because Ritva asked that kasha. How could you start off as a big city? People moving one at a time.
That doesn't happen.
That's a very good point. So the Ritva speaks out that it's not dependent on how many people are actually in it. It's dependent on what the city was built to be. If the city was originally built to be a city for the masses, to have big marketplaces and big areas that can house the public, so it was designed for a rabbin, and that makes it an Ir Shal Rabim. But if it started off as take a city like New York City, it was always built on a grand scale. But take a city like Lakewood that started off as a small rural area and it evolved. That would be an Ir Shal Yochid.
Even New York evolved.
That's right. They sold Manhattan Island for some beads. Right. It's a famous story in the Hanami. Right. But again, if it was a plan to be a city with a market in it,
nobody could have known that, or else the real estate guys would have jumped in.
David, there are some cities that are planned by rulers to be big kings.
Very few.
Yeah, Yosy Zalman's example of New York was a poor example, but there are other cities that are planned.
Yeah, and probably Washington is one of them. There are some planned cities. Yeah,
New York is a good example of a city that was once Shal Rabim and is going to become Shal Yochid. Okay, so let's see the Gemara weiter. Boy b'nei Rab Ami bar Ada harfano me'Rabba. Now we know what's called a main thoroughfare. If there's a big gate in the city on the one end, and there's a big gate in the city on the other end, of open doorway, and you have your street that runs right through the city from end to end. But what if there was no opening in the wall on one side? So you couldn't get through that end. But Sula Mikan, Upesav Mikan, on one end, on the east entrance to the city, there's a big opening in the wall that the road goes right through. But on the west side, the road doesn't go right through the wall, but there's a big set of stairs on either side of the wall. So the masses can just walk up the stairs over the wall and then walk down on the other side. So is that also considered a Rosh Hashanah? Because even though the entrance to the city is not at grade, but the masses can still get over the wall by the built staircase. Now, is that considered a door or is that considered a wall? And the nafkamina is huge. Whether or not we can make an Erev around the city. Now it's 10 to 7, so I think we have to stop. Now tomorrow is Hoshana Rabbah. So what is our plan for tomorrow? What I would love to do, I'm not sure if the Olam has time, but what I would love to do is if we could find 2 hours between now and when Shmini Atzeres stops,